Well, hey everyone, welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream with yet another star-studded panel to discuss the topic for today, our biggest news items of the 2024 year as we come to a close here. So something that I think all podcasters or news organizations feel obliged to do. So I figured we might as well give it a shot here and get our unique perspective on what has been going down in, quite frankly, a very interesting political year, although I do think this discussion should and will encompass more than just politics, because our lives are certainly more than just political. That being said, I will introduce my first guest here, Mike Taylor, whose life might just be political because you host the Political Mike podcast and show. I mean that rather tongue in cheek, obviously, but that's mainly how I know you. But it's always good to have you back on, Mike.
It's a pleasure to be on the Saving Elephants podcast again, Josh. You're a good friend. Thank you.
So we have also Scott Howard, who is no stranger to the podcast or to the live streams. He's been on a time or two. Former editor of the Freeman newsletter, which is unfortunately on its way out, but is still being archived under Justin Stapley's information. If for those of you following who like to read the Freeman, Scott, it's good to have you.
Good to be on. Thanks for having me.
And JB Shreve, again, no stranger to the podcast, host of The End of History with JB Shreve, not to be confused with Francis Fukuyama's book.
No.
TheEndOfHistory.net, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Okay. And good to have you as well.
Good to be here.
Well, this is intended to be somewhat of an open-ended conversation. I'm sure any of us have in mind the top three, at least, stories that have happened over 2024. This was one of the most bizarre election years, but as I said, it's not just the election. That being said, I wanted to just give each of you an opportunity, and I'll just say it doesn't have to be limited to three, but could each of you mention what you think the top three stories would be, and whether or not I'm just curious if we share some of these.
Well, I guess I can go ahead and start. 2024 from. I guess if we were to go back in time to this time of 2023, we knew that there's going to be a lot of elections around the globe. So 2024 was a big year for democracy in general. We had a lot of countries going to the polls this year. It wasn't just the United States of America, of course. You had, in Europe, several nations experiencing notable political shifts. In the United Kingdom, the Labour Party achieved a significant victory, which signaled a potential realignment in British politics. France witnessed a surge in support for far-right parties, indicating a shift in voter sentiment for that particular brand of politics. You had in Africa, South Africa's ruling African National Congress lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since the end of apartheid, which was huge, and that leads to a coalition government. And this outcome underscores the electorate's demand for change amid economic challenges and corruption scandals. Here in the United States, I think one of the big stories was how Democrats announced that they're going to save House Speaker Mike Johnson. Of course, there was a big standoff between the far left factions of the party and Mike Johnson over Ukraine aid. Congresswoman Green of Georgia decided that she was going to make good on her promise and pull the trigger on chaos if Mike Johnson struck a deal with the president that included aid to Ukraine. This is the same Mike Johnson who was barely elected after weeks of intra-party turmoil when Kevin McCarthy was booted in a circus of their own making. You had Mike Lawler of New York saying that was single-handedly the stupidest decision that he's seen since he was in Congress. That's the Republican from New York. That was a very eye-opening headline, because we're in an era, let's face it, where we see very little bipartisan efforts like that to promote stability as much as we can have it in the year 2024. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party decided to band together against chaos. And that was a little bit of a refreshing thing to see, especially after, rounds after round after round of voting for, at first, who we thought was going to be Speaker, Jim Jordan, and that didn't work out. Then it turned out to be all eyes turned to Steve Scalise. That didn't work out. And then out comes Mike Johnson from Louisiana, someone who himself was very much in favor of overturning the 2020 election results. But ironically, that's the person who was now promoting democracy as it pertains to Ukrainian aid. So that was an interesting story. I think another interesting story was, without a doubt, the president being pressured by big donors, by certain establishment party leaders out of the 2024 election. We have not seen something like this, at a time where there's no scandal, there's no political crisis other than a bad debate. We have to go back to 1968 to see a president voluntarily decide to drop out of a election. And honestly, there was a lot of parallels to 1968. There was a lot of college campus protests, ironically, in the same locations. As the 1968 protest that took place this time over the administration's policy as it pertains to Israel's support in the region against Gaza. President Biden decided to step aside because it just got to the point where if he stays in, the party is fractured, the donations would stop coming in, and anything, like what happened this November would have really tanked badly on his reputation after he stepped out of the Oval Office. That was a huge story. And
let me, and I appreciate that, Mike. Let me stop you there because it occurred to me if all of us mentioned three, we've already got so much on the table. I'm sure JB and Scott would like to get in too. So maybe we could just limit to your top or your two, or what do you have to say with it? Do you agree with Mike? Were those some of the bigger happenings, or is there something else you think would take precedent?
I thought Mike went deep, man. You went like a pro, like getting into the nitty gritty. My three are more broad, bigger picture, I guess. It would be just the election in general, the U.S. election, and it was almost like watching a series of a television show. Every 3 months, there's some new story that's the big story. Biden's in, Biden's out, Kamala's in, and then Trump Trump is shot, and the assassination attempts, all this, and then there's the win at the end, and the big win, and so there was that. There's on the global stage, you've got the Gaza war. And then the real surprise at the end of the year with Syria. And then, of course, there's always Ukraine. And then, is North Korea starting to get involved there and things like that. And so to me, those are my three big ones. They're a lot more big picture. And, we can certainly drill into that if you want to. But that's what I see when I look back on the year. And then all sorts of kind of counter responses to those, just what I expected and what I didn't expect.
I wish I had some profound thoughts to add to those things listed, but JB and Mike hit all the major points. Mine were the election night specifically, the result. Joe Biden dropping out, because I think that while that's sort of a sub-story on the broader, 2024 presidential election, I think the factors at play there and what surrounded that and what has come out about him and his condition since then, and what continues to come out and will continue to come out going into 2025 are major news stories in their own right. And then I think the attempt on Donald Trump's life back in July, I think it was. Again, while it's a subplot of the election as a whole grand theme, I think the fact that, for the first time in a long time, we saw a credible attempt on a presidential candidate's life that was followed up later by another, less near successful attempt, but still a serious one, suggests a tone shift in American politics that we should be concerned about going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hopefully, I'm hoping, Scott, it's not a tone shift. I'm hoping it's a one-off, but I fear that is, we could be on the precipice of entering a new era where violence is more commonplace and this sort of chaos is, I don't want to say accepted. I don't think it would ever be accepted, but that it's something that we could anticipate or expect or would happen more often.
None of us named, and it's not a political story per se, but the United Healthcare CEO. It's like that. It really is kind of still a political story. That one certainly plays into that stream of thought there too.
No, that's a very good point. And I looked up briefly before I hopped on the call with everyone. because I was just curious. Like I was looking up in France what they considered, or I just found a French outlet. What were its top 10 stories? I won't read all 10, but that was kind of interesting. Now, granted, it might just be a European perspective, but I do wonder to what degree it might be more global. They listed as 6th was Trump's return, his triumphant return, that the comeback kid, if you will, which is certainly a pretty major story in here in the United States. We would probably elevate a little higher. But the very first one they listed, which kind of surprised me, was Russian dissident Alexei Navalny dies in prison.
Oh, yeah. Didn't even mention that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that it may not have a huge impact on us here in the United States, but the brazen attempt and success of Vladimir Putin to murder his number one political opponent brazenly, I mean, that sent shockwaves throughout a lot of Western governments, and it's something that it's unfortunate. I don't think about it half the time. I mean, I've read the guy's a biography by him. I have his biography. I hadn't had a chance to read it yet, but he's an amazing figure, not a perfect figure, but certainly a courageous, heroic figure. And it is both a tragedy and also a terrible act of cowardice and disgust that he was murdered. But that was interesting to me that was the first one listed. But then the second one is AI goes mainstream. And I don't know. It's kind of one of those things like maybe 20 years from now, that might be the thing we remember the most about 2024, or maybe just sort of fizzles, kind of like what was that? The Segway scooter was supposed to revolutionize humanity. I don't remember what year that came out in. I remember reading an article that year, shortly after the 2001 terrorist attacks. It said Al-Qaeda feared to have Segway scooter technology. But I do think AI is going to have a big impact, even if we don't necessarily know what it is. But then third, renewed protests in Georgia. It talked about the uprisings and the violence in Lebanon, Ukraine's Kursk incursion. I mean, a lot of it international that I think is, as we, and JB, there's something you more specialize in, I suppose, than I do, but keep a pulse on the globe rather than just what happens here in the U.S. It did seem to be a year of, everybody mentioned elections. I read this somewhere. I don't know if it's true or not, that in 2024, it might be the year the most humans on Earth ever voted.
Yeah.
Now, you might be able to argue some of those may not be terribly legitimate elections, but at any rate, it's an interesting turn of events. And this was, in a lot of ways, not just the United States, but globally, a year of the populace. A lot of disruption. And maybe they weren't ascendant in the sense of truly taking over nations, but there was an awful lot of the old status quo was called into question. That pretends, I think, I think I've often said I think Trump is he's the symptom, not the disease. It seems to be almost a global phenomenon.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, Josh. And you talked about artificial intelligence, and I think that was key, because this was, I believe, the first election where artificial intelligence really was to a degree where it could literally fool folks who would otherwise know better. To have a picture of someone that clearly looks like the person, and they're saying words in a voice that sounds just like them, but it's not their words. And that's paired with the level of disinformation that was pumped into this election, I think was one of the key stories that a lot of pundits on the left and right just did not seem to touch on a lot in the aftermath of reflecting on what took place in November. There was a lot of misinformation that was plugged into this election. And, even going back, and I want to, for just a disclaimer, I think Donald Trump was correct in terms of saying, we don't have to have a lot of unemployment to fight inflation. I think Trump was right that we can keep interest rates low, right? But I think that the narrative that Joe Biden was this senile, sleepy guy, it's kind of from the same playbook that George W. Bush was an idiot, that Gerald Ford was a dummy. This like these caricatures that people start to embrace as reality. Biden wasn't a good speaker in 1988. In fact, he had to drop out because of plagiarism. And so, he's 82 years old. He's slowed down. He's not, the same debater he was against Paul Ryan. But the truth of the matter is the doctor that was the physician for Joe Biden, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, released a report in the aftermath of the debate in early July that showed that Biden was healthy. He was fully capable of the executive duties of his office. That was the end of the story was as clear as day. PBS published it. A lot of reputable news sources released the physician's report. And you contrast that with the ducking and the dodging on Trump's side when they were asking for the same kind of physical report. These are the things that I think folks are, I guess, normalizing in terms of a double standard. Donald Trump, this year alone, and his own opponents on the debate stage pointed this out. That he confused Nikki Haley for Nancy Pelosi, Obama for Biden. On numerous occasions, he had to be reminded what city he was in campaigning. Yet the level of intensity to demand some kind of temperature or where Trump's mental state was nowhere near the same degree as the other side. And so I think a lot of that is due to Democrats themselves buying the narrative. And I've said this before, and Josh, you've heard me. Once you undermine your candidate, you undermine the agenda. And swapping candidates did not have the effect that a lot of the experts thought it would. The donations came in, the celebrity endorsements came in, the rallies were packed. Heck, I went to some of those rallies, right? It was electric. But when you undermine the candidate and you switch gears, the public already sees insecurity. They smell a lack of conviction from a mile away. And you put that in the backdrop of inflation, right? Where, we're doing better than all the other G7 countries in terms of inflation. There's not one other G7 country that wouldn't want to switch places with the United States economy. We've had consecutive months of unemployment rising. 50 crime is at a 50-year low. But all of those things didn't resonate because we ourselves got so caught up in trying to sell a person rather than the agenda. I think that's the reason why John Fetterman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you had Ilhan Omar coming out in those early summer months, Jasmine Crockett, the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, saying we need to stop this intra-fighting and we need to just sell our agenda, focus on the agenda. And I think when you look at the Republicans, that's exactly what they did. They sold the idea that Donald Trump, you don't want him for a dinner date, that's fine, but the economy, right? Objective data didn't support this, but it was baked into the American psyche, and they bought it. And the Democrats were too busy panicking about, well, we need to put the right person out there, and then we'll be able to have a fighting chance. Well, precious time was wasted that could have been spent hammering out your agenda. And we made the same mistakes in 2016, opportunity economy. That sounded great, but what does that mean? It's too vague. Build back better. It's like we constantly, the Democrats constantly run to these sweet sounding phrases that don't exactly hit home how prices are going to be lowered. What if Harris came out and said, look, I've got a price reduction plan, right? Similar to, pull a playbook out the Glenn Youngkin book, right? A grocery tax, right? I think that we would have probably seen somewhat of a change in terms of how folks view her on the economy.
Yeah, you are correct, Mike. I have heard you before make that case, and it's one that we could easily spend the entire hour on. I'm not trying to prevent Scott and JB from getting their thoughts in. I applaud your efforts at taking what you presumably recognize to be the minority position of Joe Biden's defense in this case. By the way, I did want to share, presumably you know who this is, make it plain, Mike. One of our listeners has made a comment there. Not certain, but maybe you know how to interpret that. For those of you watching, I always say you are more than welcome to leave a comment. I will gladly share it, providing it is tasteful and something we can chew on. But let's. I don't want to get sidetracked in the entire conversation about the election. That being said, I will just tell you from a personal level, when I watched that debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and you know the debate I'm talking about, the only one. Well, I guess not the only one, the one in 2024, not the previous. I remember having a cacophony of emotions, if you will. And some of which they were so entangled that I don't know that I could dissect them all and fully explain what all I was feeling. But I remember it being profoundly uncomfortable. I felt angry. I felt fearful. I felt this sort of pain in my stomach as if I was witnessing someone who was who ought not to have been on that stage. And I don't mean that to discredit anything that Biden has been as a president. I simply mean that it was not something that I think we should have seen. And I think there are a lot of people that should have gotten to Biden first. Now, I understand you don't necessarily hold that opinion, but I'm saying that in a sense because that debate, I do remember sticking out in my mind in 2024 as one of the main highlights of my year, not in a good way. It was hard to watch. I honestly kind of felt the same way watching the debate between Fetterman and Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. It was, I almost wanted Dr. Oz or the moderator to say, you know what? Let's just call this a night. This is not helpful to anyone. It was saddening, honestly. I've never been a fan of Biden. I didn't intend to vote for Biden. I didn't vote for Biden, but I didn't like to see that. I thought that he was, whether he recognized it or not, and honestly, Mike, I know we might have a difference of opinion here. I thought he was humiliated in a way that was not necessary, did not have to come to that.
I want to add to that, Josh, because one of the things when we did the post-election autopsy with Harris, the very first thing I said, and you'll remember, is that I don't think there was a political benefit to debating Trump at this point. We have seen Trump on the national stage for 9 years. And I've said throughout the course of the year.
Well, I think it's certainly true. Biden would have done better had he not done that debate.
Right. But I mean, just the idea of, whether it's Biden, Harris, whoever, debating Trump. I'm like, we're 9 years in. People have seen Trump as president. They've seen the Democrats in office for nearly 4 years. And I'm wondering, like, who's really on the fence? Like, I'm not really sure about him. Like, he said X, Y, and Z, and I'm sold. I thought that Harris really, or Biden, in the case of early June or in the month of June, could have done what Josh Stein in North Carolina did with Mark Robinson, and just say, look, I'm not going to give my opponent a platform. Look, Biden could have said, I don't debate convicted felons. Harris could have said, I don't debate convicted felons. The same way Stein said, look, I'm not going to give Mark Robinson, a candidate with a documented history of incendiary and bigoted remarks, I'm not going to give him a stage here. And it probably would have, take Trump off and rephrase the narrative back to the fact that this is an election between a pro-democracy president who's fought to add Sweden and Finland to NATO versus a convicted felon. And I thought, somebody gave Biden bad advice. I agree with you, Josh, to not just debate, but debate so early and to challenge and, have the stakes so high. And, we were still operating as if, this was 20 years ago with regular rules, and that first debate between Donald Trump and Biden was a disaster. The moderator shrunk in size. Donald Trump bulldozer.
For a very different reason.
Right. But still, I mean, it's like at this point, it's like we know there's no benefit to debating this man.
Well, and Mike, typically speaking, not all the time, but typically speaking, among this panel, you're going to find people who are no fan of Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So I don't, and I'm not trying to speak for my fellow panelists, but I don't want to
go right ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I know the two of you. I feel like I know your views well enough, but I guess I'm saying it. I think sometimes in our bifurcated, in our team red versus blue age, I don't know. I think it's just the human psyche. It is really hard to say something negative about Team Blue without it sounding like I'm defending Team Red. I'm also not trying to be equally cynical. I think that individuals have individual failings that we can measure differently. I'm not trying to say just because this person was someone who I wouldn't have voted for, that means the other person has to be equally bad. But here I have a comment pulled up. Katie Hobbs said the same thing when she refused to debate Carrie Lake. Look, I get it. I think there are times when that is, and I'm speaking purely cynically politically here. This has nothing to do with the moral high ground. Just from the pure politics of it, there's a reason you don't have to debate Carrie Lake. There's a reason you don't have to debate, the candidate for governor in it was a Robinson. I'm blanking on his name in North Carolina. I don't think that strategy was ever going to work with Trump. That might have changed something, but I think that there is a reasonable presumption we can make that in the mind of the electorate, if they seem to legitimize this guy, maybe they're wrong to do so. Maybe he's this convicted felon no one should have voted for. but I think there was ample evidence that the Democratic Party had to do something. Maybe the debate wasn't right, but I think that he couldn't have simply been ignored as a viable threat. I do, however, want to be careful not to make the entire evening about just that election. So, Scott and JB, I would appreciate your thoughts if you have any, or we could move to another subject.
Well, I wanted to add to what you just said. Because I agree that not only was it probably not a viable prospect to just avoid debating Trump entirely, but it was par for the course for candidates who are running behind or who seem to be running behind to get a debate going and get one going early, which is what the Biden campaign was trying to do, right? The polling at the time showed Biden up 2-3 points, but if you talk to anybody on the ground and if you looked at the way the campaigns were being run, Trump was running like he was ahead, and the Biden campaign was campaigning like they were behind, and so that's why they got the debate ahead, or jumped on the debate early. Now, that did not pan out the way they expected it to, but that was the case. Not only have I found the debate is going back to Josh's, the way you felt watching it. I remember in the first 5 minutes of that debate, for the first time, having the conviction that not only did Donald Trump have a chance to win this election, but the odds were greater than 50% that he was going to win, right? Assuming Joe Biden stayed, remained a candidate. I mean, I remember that getting to Joe Biden's Medicare comment, right? He's saying we beat Medicare, and thinking, oh, this is it, right? This is the election wrapped up. Like everything after this won't matter. And then when they switched candidates, that changed. But in effect, it turned out to be true. Was that debate was sort of the moment that Trump locked up the victory, more or less.
To me, the reality is, and I don't like it, but we have become a nation where our political system is about sound bites and it's about specific images. I don't think it's a healthy development at all. But when you look back at the year, if that's what we are, that's what we've become. Man, it sure played out hard against the Democrats and really well for the Republicans, specifically for Trump. At the beginning of the year, we're all talking, we're expecting political violence. There's this threat of political violence that's underlying everything throughout the year. This Mike mentioned like the artificial intelligence and how we were kind of prepped. We're waiting for Facebook to just go crazy, or whatever your social media is to go crazy. And it really wasn't necessary because people could play just legitimate quotes from Joe Biden, just like videos. And I realized there were some that were out of context and everything, but it was very believable after what people saw in the debates, these icons of who Joe Biden was. And keeping in mind that the Democrats did change up their primaries so that he would be in control by the time they got there this summer, moved South Carolina up in the process to make sure he was there. And it really backfired really hard there. And then countering that against, was it a week after the debates, the assassination attempt, and Trump's bleeding, looks like he's bleeding from the head and screaming, fight, fight, fight. And it's like, wow, at the time, it just looked like this guy's got it in the bag. I don't know how you can come back from how bad Biden looked last week and how good Trump looks this week. And yeah, they changed out candidates, but to me, well, I don't think she's a great campaigner to begin with, but she never got a chance really to be tested throughout the year. But she's never done really well when she is tested in the past. But that's another story. But it just played out. If you look back on the year and just in a paragraph, that it played out perfectly for the Republicans and horribly for the Democrats, as far as all of those sound bites and all of those little iconic moments.
Yeah, but based on, when, as Scott said, that moment where Biden mentions we finally beat Medicare, that was not the only moment in 2024 where I felt like, oh my God, we just reelected Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There was the assassination
Yeah.
attempt. The second one didn't seem to it was almost like the second one was boring because we didn't have a soundbite or we didn't have a video to look at. And so halftime I walk around and remember, oh yeah, they tried that twice, didn't they? The first one was made for TV.
Yeah.
There was also the Alvin Bragg convictions beginning with. And I am not trying to say, I'm trying to state this without opening a can of worms. I'll just put it this way without revealing too much of my thoughts. Of all the things Donald Trump could have been tried and convicted on, I think Alvin Bragg's was uniquely poorly suited for the election year, or for the Democratic Party. In other words, I think of all the things that he could have been a convicted felon on, it created in the mindset of either the average Trump supporter, or in some cases people that were just neutral, whoa, this is lawfare. This is wrong. Trump is the victim here. I have a lot of nuanced opinions about that. I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent. I'm simply saying between Alvin Bragg, between the assassination, between that debate, it was bizarre. It looked almost providential. I wish I had a better word for that, because that sounds like I'm a Christian nationalist MAGA America to say it that way. But it was kind of weird. Jonah Goldberg has this line about Donald Trump is the sort of person that, goes around saying they said it couldn't be done. Nobody believed me. Everybody doubted me, but I did it. I put all my money in the lottery and I won. And the problem with that phrase I found is that only works so many times. Like, how do you explain the guy plays Russian roulette over and over and over, and he keeps rolling the dice, if you will. It could just be where, or the other thing Jonah Goldberg often says is he accuses somebody of touching a monkey paw, and that's why we're in this mess. It's upside down world, but it's, I don't know. Does anyone else feel that way, that there's like a bizarre amount of happenstance that had things gone just a little bit different, we could be looking at a very different story?
Yeah.
Certainly. I think that's true of history in general, obviously. But 2024, you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast that perhaps AI is the thing we remember 2024 for. I disagree, and that's because I think 2024 is one of those years that the history books will remember as a year rather than just as, one or two events. And because of that, I think the fact that every event that happened by such a, like a margin of difference here or there, right? Donald Trump doesn't turn his head. Alvin Bragg decides for some reason or another to indict on a different legal grounds. Joe Biden drops out in March. Whatever the changes could have been, things look radically different. Because there are so many moments like that, they all feel magnified. I think we feel that weight of history on this year. I had a point. I forgot what it was. I'll stop now.
That's the problem with live stream.
Mike mentioned the 1968 elections, and I've actually been reading a book this last week on the 1968 elections, and it's just, you can't help but reflect on the similarities to this year and that. And I think I would do that with, if it was 1984 that I was reading about. But the George Wallace and the populist candidacy of his candidacy at that time, and how much things seem to be going his way at that, during that year. It looked like he was being proved right all throughout the year. All of this disaster is happening. And maybe that's part of the nature of populism, is that it's always going to appeal to the least common denominator or the most negative reality that's out there. And I think that's part of what makes Trump kind of fall into that right groove so often, is there's just a lot of negativity out there, and there's a lot of frustration out there. And that's the nature of populism. That's what causes it to come to the surface. And it's not a well-developed thought just yet, but it's something I've been thinking on as I've been reading about that election.
I'm curious here about this general. Part of the reason I sort of started off somewhat cynically talking about we're doing one of these, the top stories of 2024, is I don't know that we humans have a great capacity for truly grappling with what is in fact a top story in the rearview mirror. And I took a moment to look up, well, what were the top stories of 2004, 20 years ago? And some of them like, okay, that kind of held up. President George W. Bush wins re-election. That's something, somewhat, certainly the four of us who pay attention to politics, that's probably something we would have thought of. But the Olympics held in Athens, I mean, it's kind of cool. It was back in Greece, but I forgot about that. Martha Stewart goes to prison. I remember that. I didn't know what happened then. That didn't impact my life all that much. Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl. I think we all remember where we were when Janet Jackson had that wardrobe malfunction. the fact that this makes the list, I know what that is. I remember,
Yeah.
but it's like, really? That was the story that had the biggest. The Statue of Liberty reopens to the public. I didn't know it was closed. Reagan's funeral held. I remember that. And then the DC sniper found guilty. Of course, I remember after 2001, just the nation, in effect, being locked in fear between another terrorist attack or what was it, anthrax. I remember Neil Bort's radio personality made the comment that if you didn't like where you were working or you wanted to knock off early for the evening, just go into the break room and dump some white powder on the conference table or on the break room table, and within a half an hour they have the whole building evacuated. And I do remember the DC sniper was something we're all kind of. I was here in Tulsa; it was taking place in DC, but you never knew, could somebody just shoot you from a moving vehicle? I forgot about it. That was not a big deal. So I guess I'm curious. This is sort of an open-ended question, but I'm curious. Like, these things that are a big deal to us in this year, is there any of this that you think is going to so fade in the limelight that it's almost trivial we would be discussing it?
Well, just looking at this year alone, just think back of where we were in March with the State of the Union, right? Biden was on top of the world. I mean, I remember Gregory Meeks shaking his hand and he said, "You sound like a Baptist preacher tonight," because the speech was forceful. There was a back and forth. Biden was on his feet between the Republicans like Marjorie Greene, who were trying to heckle him, especially when it came down to the point about Social Security. And he said, "Okay, so we're all on board, no cutting Social Security, right?" And so the camera then pans back to the Republicans, and they're like, "Yeah, no, we're not for that." And then they're talking about the immigration bill that was tanked, and James Langford is on the camera saying that's not true. When people were saying that his bill was not something that would have adequately addressed some chaos at the southern border. And so it's a different world. March 2024 is a different world from June 2024, and I'm just thinking, that's just what a period of, I guess, less than 6 months, and you think back and you're like, well, by this time in 2025, what are going to be some of the lasting, stories that I guess are the defining moments? Is your question, Josh? I truly believe that as powerful as the assassination imagery was, the fact that the polling really remained relatively unchanged just showed that we were so dug in. On our respective sides, that it made for powerful imagery, but it didn't really reflect, in polling, people, I think, made their decisions already, from the time they knew that Trump was the GOP nominee and Biden was the alternative. There was very little that could really shake that. And so there's certain stories I think about Fani Willis, right? I think one of the stories coming out of the aftermath of the election was that there was this idea that Trump has been targeted so much from these different court proceedings, whether it be in Georgia, in Washington, D.C., or New York. And there was a group of people that just said, enough is enough. We're just tired of hearing about this, right? That he had become a martyr in their eyes. I think about the college protests. There was serious concern that could spill over into the DNC and possibly, start chaos.
Talk about, just incidentally, Mike, talk about a weird year for the Democratic Party to pick Chicago.
Right.
They dodged a bullet there.
but it was more 1996 than 68. The convention was very well run. There was some anxiety about how this was going to turn out, but it was actually a convention that was high energy, very well disciplined. We even had Republicans take the stage, Republicans like Adam Kinzinger. We had people who were in the realm of Hollywood and national security take the stage. It was a very made for TV event. And the image of Little John during the roll call, playing Turn Down for What as the Georgia delegation was coming in. I mean, it was that was one of the most memorable parts, in politics for the summer. I do think that the debate probably with Biden and Trump would go down as one of the defining moments of the year, because so much has been, that they talked about that for like 27, 28 days ongoing, right? The fact that AOC filed 2 articles of impeachment against 2 sitting Supreme Court justices, that was just like, that took a back seat. I think another story is the Supreme Court presidential immunity decision. That's going to be a big thing that people point back to 2024 about, because let's face it, it bust the cap open. It opened up a new era of presidential authority. I believe personally that they were not intending for Biden to get that kind of authority, but it was specifically designed for Trump. And so, from here on out, the president now has authority the likes of which we haven't seen, and we're entering a new era in terms of Second Amendment power.
In terms of Second Amendment power?
So I meant Article 2 power. Forgive me.
Okay. I was like, I must have missed something.
Article 2 power, executive authority.
Fair enough. I mean, I'd always presume the president could be armed at any moment, but I guess I never given it much thought. Yeah, Mike, it's interesting because one of the things I find very interesting is when I listen to media of different points of view, if you will, the left, the right down the middle, and that I don't like putting it in just those two camps, because I think the left and the right have 1,000 different perspectives. I certainly don't agree with everything on the right. The things that animate them and they fear or they find interesting and talk about doesn't necessarily have spillover sometimes to the other side. And it is really interesting to me the degree to which, and I'm not trying to, I'll just broad brush it here. I hear from my friends on the left talk about that Supreme Court decision as if it is an unjust and dangerous expansion of the executive power. And I will just say, even though, regardless of my thoughts on the on the Supreme Court decision, I welcome either side anytime they're concerned about an expansion of the executive authority. Sometimes it makes sense, but for the most part, I wished both the left and the right were far more willing to sort of rein in the executive position. But that being said, I mean, is that, do you gentlemen find that to be true too in your circles? Do they talk often about, because the way I've heard it presented both ways. One is that this is an unchecked, that Trump can literally do anything he wants now in his capacity as president and cannot be held to the law. Others saying, look, it's an understandable compromise because, of course, acting as president, there are certain things he ought to be able to do he couldn't do as a private citizen. And this is nothing more than the Supreme Court sort of developing the beginnings of a litmus test. I'm not an attorney. I'm not using the right terminology here. But is that what you guys have heard about this particular case, or does that even make a splash in your circle or acquaintances?
Not in
all my acquaintances are under 30, so they don't talk about this much. But those people who I know who do remember that generally thought the decision was correct. I count myself among them. These people on the right side of the aisle. I think the decision was as correct as the court was going to be. A position that I saw too little of, and this is biased because it's my position, is that the reason this case is complicated is because we've asked the court to answer a question they should not have had to answer. There are certain questions that should not need be asked, and this was a question that should not have had to have been asked.
Right.
But as far as the decision itself, everybody I know that paid attention to it, right of center, with a handful of exceptions, generally thought the decision was okay. So, which is understandable, given that the discourse around the court itself, the discourse around Trump, how partisan both the things have become. It makes sense that people on the right side of the aisle would think the case was generally decided correctly.
It doesn't come up a lot on my side, in my circles. It's all just paradigms, good guy, bad guy. Each side sees their guy as the Messiah and the other guy as the devil, and it doesn't. I don't like any of that because I don't fit in any of those circles anymore, and that's one of the things that frustrates me, because I don't see the two sides as that much different as far as the corruption goes. And I know, and I recognize Trump's a special animal, yes, granted, but they're both corrupt. They're all corrupt. I mean, there's a reason, or there's not a reason, but there's the uniqueness that Biden pardons Hunter, pardons his son, this full pardon, a unique level of pardon that he could have done it a lot of different ways, but did it this specific way. And that headline is taken away by someone assassinating the CEO of United Healthcare. It's like I think people feel that there's a lot of corruption on both sides of things. And the problem, I think, is more, we all believe that the other side is so evil. And so we have this righteous indignation, this moral grounds, justification of believing that. And I think that's a real dangerous place for our society as a whole. No matter who you think is right, when we're all seeing the other side as evil and our side is, pure and righteous, I just don't think it works that way. And I think that's a dangerous place to be.
And there was and Scott, I'm assuming this is what you meant when you said that, like, in 2016, I remember people asking particular questions about, well, how should we handle this situation given the race between Hillary and Trump? And my response was, you don't nominate people like Hillary and Trump. You don't put the nation in this particular position. And I'm not saying that those two are uniquely terrible, horrible, bad, but I think they were certainly unpopular. They were certainly corrupt in different ways, but ways that, in my view, far disqualify them from running from those offices. And I agree with the statement that the Supreme Court should have never been asked that question, because, quite frankly, the American people should have never nominated and elected Donald Trump. And further, the United States Congress ought to have, at the very least, banned him from running again through an impeachment. Maybe a deal could have been reached where, look, you're not going to serve prison time, but you will not run again. I think it was the easy, cowardly way out on the part of the United States Congress. And then we end up in these horrible situations where the court is being asked to do something it is not designed to do. We don't want to live in an era in which we're literally trying elected officials, past or present. That is a very dangerous era to live in. I'm not saying people have operated in bad faith in doing so, but you don't have to tax the imagination much to think of a scenario in which this literally could become sort of a one-party nation, right? If a certain party takes power, they could legally prevent the other party from ever winning again. The best way to get to that is not for the court cases to go the way you want. It's for it to never end up in court in the first place.
No, I agree. I mean, the American system requires a certain level of implicit acknowledgement on all sides that some things are out of bounds, or that some things are below the standard of the office. And when that isn't, legally construed, right? There are things that are custom that are not law, but that are adhered to as if they were law. Mm-hmm. And as I said at the time, as you see in a lot of instances, law is required when customs fail. And it's not good when customs fail, because the law does not cover everything, right? Whatever customs you have, your personal conviction that some things are beyond the pale is a lot more impactful than whatever the court can say. So when we ask these questions of the court, like time and time and time again, when they have to hash out the actual legal boundaries of these very vague questions as to what counts as criminal behavior on the president's part, what's not, what's just acting as the president in the capacity of the president, or these various instances, you decay the system, because it's not meant to be this legalistic, and it's not meant to be this cut and dry. Right? We shouldn't have to wonder, what is the exact boundary that I can walk up to without stepping over, right? We shouldn't get to that point. We should all just say, I'm not even going to go near that edge of I'm not going to go near that cliff at all. So I don't have to worry about stepping over the cliff, because I'm just not going to be there.
I'm waiting on Josh to throw out a quote right here from Madison or Adams or someone about character and honor.
Well, they're going through my mind, but I'm.
It's like, here it is, Josh. This is it. Softball.
I have a quote.
Okay.
I think this quote is from Adams, actually, when he was, basically discussing the system of checks and balances, the concept of checks and balances to uphold the rule of law. He used the metaphor, two girls dividing a cake, one cuts, the other chooses, ensuring fairness. And when I think about this simple yet effective, analogy, I can't help but reflect on, if Richard Nixon were alive today, he would be green with envy with a court that would want to consolidate power in the executive branch. I think that this decision wasn't about protecting Trump from Biden or Special Counsel Jack Smith as much as it was about shielding him from being held accountable for January 6th. That's why I think that regardless of how the election went, because of this ruling, Jack Smith's case was up a lot of odds. I get folks, saying, look at Hunter Biden, but, when we look at history, not to say that what he did was fine, but we look at Jimmy Carter, who just passed away yesterday. He pardoned his family members, Bill Clinton pardoning his brother, Roger. So we've seen presidents pardon family members before, in addition to the fact that I just want to point out that, Hunter Biden, was already going through the accountability, right? He was paying back his taxes, for which he was being charged for not paying. He was being charged for a simple gun possession offense. And you contrast that with the president of the United States, who did put his hand on the Bible to swear and defend the Constitution. Hunter Biden, for all his sins, never took that oath of office. And so Donald Trump, as the man who did swear to protect and defend the laws of the Constitution, we should expect more, especially from someone who was actively seeking the office yet again and actually won the office. And so this decision, for generations, it has set in motion an imperial presidency. It's an imperial court that paved the way for an imperial presidency. There's been talk from people, even folks on ESPN. I even heard folks on ESPN. I forgot his name. Stephen A. Yeah, he said, Biden should pardon Trump. I've heard Chris Cuomo. I was surprised to hear Chris Cuomo say, I agree with you. But my thing is, in 1974, folks made the same argument that this was going to somehow bring the country together. That if Ford pardoned Nixon, we could just turn the page on Watergate. And, not only did it cost him in 1976, but people to this day feel like Nixon should have been held accountable. If we're truly a nation of laws and not of men, if we're truly a nation where no man, even the president, is not above the law, let the judicial process run its course. And just like in 1974, in 2024, I think that, pardoning Trump would not do any good. I just, not that he needs it thanks to this decision and the fact that, people are dismissing and dropping cases left and right against him. But, you think about it, it's like, how would this bring people together? What is the message this sends to the world when, we're in a situation where, we talked about how many democracies voted this year. Faith in democracy on a global level is at an all-time low. How would this actually work to not just improve that low standing of democracy, but bring people in the United States together? I just don't see it. But I think another story was Mitch McConnell's absence. And Mitch McConnell, of course, was the chief architect of the current Supreme Court that we're seeing in place here. And in 2025, the big story is going to be the relationship between McConnell's replacement, John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, and Donald Trump, and how they conduct business. And we saw a little bit of that, a little bit of a preview of that this past month with the debt ceiling debacle.
Let me, I'm going to completely switch gears on us, and you gentlemen are welcome to respond to that if you are so inclined. I know some of you may need to leave early. If you got to hop out, that's totally cool. But I wanted to end on a slightly less political and slightly less heavy note, which is just New Year's resolutions. I mean, this question always comes up. Do you guys participate in New Year's resolutions? Do you encourage them? Do they work? And if so, what are the guidelines? What are good resolutions? What aren't? Those sorts of things. I will go first very briefly. I typically don't, but I do weirdly year-long resolutions that start like in March or June or something. There's just something mental about I don't want to start in January. I don't know why, but this year I am. I'm going to purchase a.
You're a Chinese New Year's resolution.
Yeah. Well, it's more my CPA fiscal year resolution, if you will, June 30 days.
The new tax year. Yeah.
Yes.
April 16th, New Year, New Me.
Exactly. But this year I'm going to purchase a course about, and I'm going to stick to it for about a year, trying to practice the banjo daily. I did this a couple of years ago, not on January 1st, but there's an online course I saw where I can stick with it. I don't know. Sometimes those sort of like just do this sort of as daily habit works for me. I've read through the Bible a year several times, was just doing it daily, things of that nature. But But I also know that sometimes these things don't work at all. We all try to delude ourselves into thinking we can remake ourselves come January 1, and within a couple of weeks. I remember going to running the treadmills at Planet Fitness. You couldn't get a treadmill the first 2 weeks of January,
Yeah.
and then by the third week, there wasn't anybody there. So what do you guys think about that general concept?
I'm all about it, man. I don't think it's about so much keeping the resolutions. I've called them objectives because, resolutions like, okay, maybe not, but there's an objective in place. And I just think it's a healthy process to go through and think about the things I would like to focus on this year. And I always try to take, during this time of year, I'm actually taking a couple of days off this year to focus on the year ahead, but also I've got a little list. It's like, okay, what are the 25 things I'm grateful for 2024? And so I'm doing that, just a healthy perspective, and then looking forward. What's the things I want to make as far as my objectives for 2025? Nothing as cool as the banjo. I've got a guitar here begging me to come and play it, to figure out how to play it, and it still is not going to happen in 2025, maybe 2026. But I'd like to.
Oh man, if you pick up a banjo, you've got to beat the women away with a stick. If you
I'm sure that's the way it goes in Tulsa. But that's
hey, dude, you're in Arkansas.
Yeah, hey, we're more of the harmonica over here. But no, I'd like to focus on some foreign language skills. I honestly want to do a course on AI just because I don't get it. I'm feeling old by not getting it enough. It's like, Chat GPT, isn't this like Google? And so I'm doing something wrong. And so stuff like that, just little things, but it's like, okay, I just want to put a few of these things in my pathway.
I too am a fan of New Year's resolutions. I had a list. I got to go back and look at what my 2023 ones were. I think I went 50-50. I think I had 6 and I hit 3 of them. This year, I'm going to try to go back and get the ones I didn't finish. But I think they're useful. I think the desire to start anew and do better is admirable. And I think most people in most places need some sort of anchor to make it work, which is why January 1st is such a good anchor, right? Not everybody can say March 27th, I'm going to wake up and become a new person. So I think January 1st is a useful heuristic for people. So I like the idea.
Well, I guess I'll use my time to kind of like also pull a little bit of a tribute to Jimmy Carter. I think when I look at Carter, I can't help but want to dedicate some time to volunteering for something that leaves a lasting impact to improve the life of someone else. That can look like different things. It could look like not just volunteering to build a house for Habitat for Humanity, but it can also look like, giving, good counsel to someone who's looking for legal services, but they can't really afford it, pro bono work. It could look like, volunteering to give your time to read, to kids and instill within them a passion to learn more about history, right? There's a need to know more about American history in this country. We need more civic-minded voters. And if we have more civic-minded voters, disinformation is not as much of a threat as it is. Those are the things that I think I'm looking forward to dedicating my time towards in the new year. Whether or not that takes place once a month, I don't know yet, but I do want to bring a level of discipline that I haven't, even more discipline to 2025 than in the previous year.
Well, JB, Scott, Mike, thank you all once again for joining me on the live stream. Thank you, everybody out there watching. I appreciate people participating and those who were just enjoying the conversation, as was I. I wish all three of you gentlemen well in your endeavors for the new year. So, just a time for reflection, just starting off hopefully on the right foot. We can certainly all use that from time to time in our lives. So with that, I'm going to close it for the evening, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, Josh.